on Eden. Eden is, for me, a very important idea and dream. Eden, here I mean the Garden of Eden, the garden described very early in the Christian Bible, but reflected as a widespread myth in almost all religions, and certainly in the monotheistic faiths, and in many tribal beliefs and so on. And what this garden consists of is perfection, happiness, absence of pain, beauty, integration, a life where you don't have to work characteristically, you just wander around and nature provides for you. It's full of beautiful flowers and so on. I have in my mind pictures by Savory, the artist, and others who've depicted the Garden of Eden, and it's full of beautiful trees and shrubs and flowers. There are no wild animals. Any animals there are seem to be very friendly towards human beings, except, as we'll come to later, there are no diseases, there's no poverty, there's obviously no war, and it's filled with love and companionship once Eve arrives. And so you have the two happy, innocent figures wandering through this garden. And that is enormously enticing and comforting and beautiful. And then it all goes wrong. Then the serpent, the snake, somehow gets in there, worms, as it were, his way in, and starts muttering and making suggestions that they should eat an apple, and persuades Eve, supposedly, to eat the apple, or to give the apple to Adam, and they eat it. Now, the first reflection I have is how sad and illogical that is, because where did the serpent come from? Who made the serpent? Because in the background of Eden, of course, is God, who has made this wonderful paradise. So why should God? It wasn't Adam or Eve who summoned the serpent into the garden. So why should God put a creature in the garden that is going to cause the downfall of man? God is responsible. It's not the serpent. He's made by God. So it raises the whole problem of pain and suffering and where it came from. The second thing about it is that what the apple did was to open the eyes of Adam and Eve. They could see reality in a way they hadn't seen before. Obviously, one example was they saw that they were naked. They didn't have clothes, so they suddenly became full of shame and tried to cover themselves up. And this is the loss of innocence, the absence of shame. And that, again, why were we forced to lose innocence in that way? And the second thing that the apple did was to bring in morality. Before, there was no separation between good and evil. Everything was good. There was no evil. And therefore, you looked out in the world in an innocent way, filled with good things. The apple gave you the knowledge of good and evil, and you realized that the world is polarized, that some things are good and some things are evil. And that, again, is a shocking revelation, and again, created by God. He gave us the knowledge of good and evil, and many people would say, well, that's what he had to do, but it came from him. And it was that loss of innocence and the new knowledge that the world is not just white, but it is black and white, which alerted to God to the fact that they'd eaten the apple. I would have thought he could have seen that anyway. And of course, he was angry with them. Now, why was he angry? He'd caused the problem, but anyway, he was angry and he said, clear out. clear off, and he expelled them from the garden, and this was the beginning of all our woes. So that myth of Eden is terribly powerful in our mythology, and it lies behind much of our thought. Just to give you one example, one of the greatest, most influential political philosophies of the last 200 years is Marxism. And Marxism is based on the works of Karl Marx, a Jewish political philosopher who has, I think, in the back of his mind, without explicitly saying it, the myth of the Garden of Eden. And a lot of his work is really trying to reverse the expulsion, to bring us back to a world where there is no separation, no pain, no suffering. So all the things that have accumulated since we were expelled, private property, the state, formalized religions, all these things which are part of the downfall of man, should be abolished. You should clear them all away, level everything down, rebuild the walls of Eden, and all would be innocent and well. Now, we don't need much of a history lesson to see where it was a hopeful vision of the communist revolution leveling everything, led to the Soviet Union, led to the Chinese Revolution, led to the French Revolution before Marx, and of course Pol Pot and others. So it is a delusion, because much as we may want to return, and psychologists might say it's return to the womb, we might want to return to the womb, but if we do it by pulling everything down, imagine you go out of Eden, you're expelled, you build up a sort of world outside Eden, which is based on all sorts of principles and rules and conventions of private property and the state and so on and so on. And then you tell the people there, this is no good, you need to go back to Eden, pull all that down. And what actually happens is you pull all your architecture and everything you've built up over centuries and thousands of years of civilization, and you are left with nothing. So Eden-like visions, which are also called millenarian, this is that the end of the world will come, the millennium, the return of Jesus, the return of whatever, that will come. And when that happens, when the dream is fulfilled, when the rapture, as the rapturists call it, comes, then we will all be sucked, or in the case of the rapturists, only a few thousand of us, will be sucked out of this world of pain, suffering, anxiety, indecision, into a perfect rapture that emulates in some ways the Garden of Eden. Now, again, it's a lovely dream, but it's again a delusion, and we have to be very careful. So we can aim at many of the nice things of Eden, a beautiful garden, trying to minimize pain and suffering and uncertainty and all those sorts of things, and gradually build Eden, as the Eden Project in Cornwall does to a certain extent. And that's fine. But if we think we can reverse the whole of half a million years of human history with one stroke of rebellion and millenarian destruction, we won't bring in Eden. We'll just bring in the concentration camps, the gulags, the elimination of all our enemies, and so on. So long live Eden, long live the dream, which has fueled much of the great poetry and literature and philosophies of the world. But remember that we don't live in Eden, and we can build little ecological Edens, as I have in my garden, which is a Garden of Eden as far as I'm concerned, beautiful and no death and full of certainty. We can build our own Edens, but we have to be very careful if we try to build Edens for other people as well. So enjoy Eden.